Many of you might recall the powerful images of Tahrir Square that circulated in the news and across social media in 2011, when 17 million people took the streets in Egypt to overthrow their ruthless dictator. Now, I want to ask you to think about the women who were there. One study confirmed that 40 to 50% of those protesters were women. Egyptian women organized and led protests. They guarded the entrances to the square. They gave speeches and led chants. And they maintained Facebook and Twitter feeds. After the ousting of President Mubarak, a coalition of 13 Egyptian feminist organizations demanded the full inclusion of women in the new government. They called for safety for women in the streets and an end to police violence and corruption. Yet, Egyptian feminists didn't just start demanding gender and social justice in 2011. They have been there, organizing feminist movements for over a century. These are just a few examples of the bold and unapologetic feminist activism emanating from what many people think of as the Arab region. Yet for many people in the United States, the very concept of Arab feminism seems like an oxymoron. That's because our understanding of both of these terms, Arab and feminism, is so narrow. On the one hand, there's a popular cluster of ideas about what Arab means, namely that all Arabs and Muslims are the same, and that there is a single Arab Muslim culture that condones terrorism, oppresses women, is homophobic, and religiously fanatical. On the other hand, there's a popular cluster of ideas about feminism, namely that it's all about equal rights and equal pay and saving women from sexual oppression. Together, all of these ideas make it hard to see Arab feminism, let alone to recognize that there are, in fact, many different kinds of Arab feminism. It's not just one thing. In order to understand Arab feminism, we need to pay attention to Arab women's diversity and the many different political and historical conditions in which they live. And we need to know that the word Arab refers to 22 really different countries in both Asia and Africa, and that not everyone living there is Arab, and not everyone living there is Muslim. Now, this might sound commonsensical, but it's remarkable how often discussions about Arab women in the United States fail to do this. Let's take one of the most common examples, the veil. Many people believe that all Arab women are Muslim and cover their hair. Many of you might not have guessed that I'm from an Arab country, Jordan. In the United States, the veil has become a symbol of what many people think of as an out-of-date cultural and religious practice that oppresses Arab or Muslim women. But what this framing doesn't tell you is that the veil has different meanings in different places, and how this meaning has changed over time. Say you attended an event at an Arab American organization in Chicago in the 1980s. You would see virtually no women covering their hair. That's because in the 1980s, people from the Arab region thought about their identities according to the politics of that particular time period, a time when Arabism and socialism were more popular than Islamism. Now, say you attended a similar event today. You would see many of the women covering their hair. Far from being an outdated cultural tradition, the veil has taken on new meaning in the 21st century, at a time when people are increasingly turning to religion as a refuge across the globe, including in the United States, especially after September 11th. In response to increased anti-Muslim racism and war, more and more Arab Muslim women are proudly claiming their faith and their Muslim identity by covering their hair. At the University of Illinois, where I teach, many Muslim women students say covering their hair provides a form of empowerment in a society that paints all Arabs and Muslims as evil terrorists. Some consider covering their hair a feminist stance that challenges the ways US society sexually objectifies all women's bodies. Ultimately, there's no one reason why women cover their hair. It depends on the person, the situation, or the historical moment. Now, accepting this idea is hard for many people, not only because of how they think about Arabs or Muslims, but also because of how they think about feminism. And this has been one of the reasons why many white middle-class feminists also have a hard time seeing Arab feminism. Just like being Arab doesn't have one meaning, the same applies to feminism. For example, many of you are familiar with the feminist argument popularized in the 1970s that says the traditional nuclear family and the idea of women staying at home is oppressive to women. So that's why we need to get all women out of the house and into the workforce. Yet Black feminists have been saying they've been forced to work for a long time because historically they've had to, whether as enslaved peoples or because they needed to support their families. So just getting into the workforce isn't the problem. And while white feminists have been telling battered women to call the police for help, women of color have pointed out their fear of calling the police because the police might arrest, deport, or even shoot you or your family members when they show up. So a person's feminist perspective is often shaped by their own specific life conditions and the many different kinds of injustices they may have faced. Because of the specific history and politics of the Arab region, Arab feminists have our own set of concerns, yet we rarely get to talk about these. In the United States, so much emphasis has been placed on the idea that Arab culture, Islam, and the veil are oppressive to women. As a result, those of us working for gender justice in Arab communities are now feeling really tired because we have to spend so much of our time fighting racist stereotypes that have been around forever, or having to talk about simplistic issues like what Arab women wear, instead of getting to address the current political issues that concern us now. So, now that I've challenged how both Arab and feminism are conventionally understood, what does Arab feminism actually look like? I want to address two examples. One is more global, and the other is very local. But my aim isn't to say, here's what all Arab feminists think about these issues, because again, there are many different forms of Arab feminism. Instead, I want to highlight the kinds of questions Arab feminists have been asking. My first example is in Iraq, where rates of violence against women have drastically increased. Now, if you already believe that all Arabs are violent towards women, this wouldn't surprise you. But you'd be wrong. And you'd fail to consider how decades of war in that country have impacted women in particular. The war on Iraq has impacted women disproportionately. From an increase in child mortality rates, poverty, and malnutrition, to less and less safety in the streets for women, and decreased opportunities for education and employment, all of which push women back into the home and increase conservative views about women's roles and their freedom of movement. So these shifts aren't a result of some timeless Arab culture that oppresses women. They're the result of very current geopolitical realities. And that's why many Arab feminists have been asking, why are we so eager to accept the idea of a backwards foreign culture that oppresses women? Is it because that's easier than confronting the very devastating impact the US war on terror has had on women in countries like Iraq? And when are more and more feminists in the United States going to start defining war as a form of violence against women? For my second example, I want to turn right here to Oak Park. In the spring of this year, you may recall, Oak Park River Forest High School was vandalized by anti-Black, anti-Semitic, and anti-Muslim graffiti, an incident that was covered a fair amount in the local news. That coverage and the community outrage it sparked focused primarily and importantly on the anti-Black and anti-Semitic parts of the story, largely ignoring the hatred directed at Muslims. This left many Muslims and others affected by anti-Muslim racism, like Arab Christians, who are often perceived to be Muslim, to wonder whether our experiences matter and whether anti-Muslim racism is even seen or given importance in the United States. As an Arab American feminist scholar and activist, I immediately had another set of questions. I wondered how this incident affected Arab or Muslim girls at the school. High schools are already highly gendered spaces, meaning a girl's sense of safety and belonging is shaped by very different factors than boys. But without a feminist lens, racism is often addressed from a gender-neutral perspective. The very idea that all Arabs or Muslims are terrorists is gendered, meaning the terrorist imagined is usually someone perceived to be a man or a boy. Yet Arab or Muslim girls are often perceived as guilty by association. Arab American high school girls have reported having their headscarves pulled off by boys shouting things like, "Why don't you take off your veils? Are you still supporting Osama bin Laden?" Now, this last example is quite vivid and upsetting, and many of you probably would have no problem identifying it as a racist act. Yet the very idea that Arab feminism is an oxymoron, or that many people can't even imagine that Arab feminism exists, is also a form of racism. Ideas and actions can be racist. Ideas are just harder to see compared to actions, but their effects can be even harder to address as a result. Ideas lead to actions. A person who believes that all Arabs are naturally prone to violence might hesitate to speak out when the US bombs an Iraqi city and turns it into rubble. In closing, I want to come full circle. I opened with images of women fighting for revolution in Egypt in 2011. As I speak, women are actively leading revolutions in Iraq and Lebanon. Yet, revolutions aren't just big public events that happen far away. Arab feminists have been leading a revolution right here in the United States. A revolution in how people think about women and gender in the Middle East and in the US. A revolution born out of our experiences surviving US interventions in our part of the world for the last 5 decades. A revolution that demands us to think critically about the gendered effects of imperial war, racism, and global economic injustices from the US to the Middle East and far beyond. Yet the key to this revolution is that you need to be part of it too. Arab feminists can't do it on our own, precisely because it's about changing US ideas and society. And the reality is, your lives are already deeply intertwined in these issues. From how you consume how the media and culture portrays Arab women, to how your tax dollars go directly to fund policies that shape the lives of women in the Arab region, to your actions or your inactions in the everyday moments of your lives. Just by listening to this talk, you have become part of this revolution. The question now is whether you will help move it forward. Because part of being an ally and an advocate in solidarity with Arab feminism means asking yourself what your revolutionary role could be. Whether it's voting for or against a particular policy, having a conversation with friends, relatives, or neighbors, joining an anti-war protest, thinking critically about what you see in the news, or caring enough about each and everyone in your community that you wouldn't hesitate to speak out whenever you see any form of racism, sexism, or hate. In my own life, I try to live by the words of Black feminist Audre Lorde, who says, "I am not free, while any woman is unfree, even if her shackles are very different than my own." So let us remember, the Arab feminist revolution is here. The question now is, what role will you play? Thank you.